Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming to the 61st Annual Edward H. Hume Memorial Lecture. We're really happy to have you here, partly because we did not do this lecture last year due to COVID, so this is a bit of a reopening for us, and we're really especially happy to see you. You can learn more about Dr. Hume on the back of your brochure here. He was a physician, he was a Yale College graduate. He spent a good part of his career in China, where he founded the Xianghua Hospital and medical school. And has a connection to the Yale-China Association. I think some of our Yale-China Association friends are here tonight. But yes, as I said, we're very happy to have you. I know a few people are still making their way in. Please note this lecture is being recorded. So if you ask a question, you may show up on the audio, which will be posted to our YouTube channel. Afterwards, if you know anybody who missed it, please let them know that it's being recorded and will be posted. And so, yeah, without further ado, I will turn it over to Rana Mitter, the Elihu Professor of History, who will introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce my friend, Professor Rana Mitter, who is going to be speaking to us today for the 61st Hume Lecture, with the title, "A Kite Flies Against the Wind, Internationalism, Identity and Ideology in the Shaping of Post-War China and the Legacy for Today." So Rana is Professor of History and Politics of Modern China at Oxford University. He's a fellow of St. Cross College. He was the inaugural director of the Oxford China Center from 2013 to 2020, when he made his escape from that one in order to do more books, I'm sure. He has done quite a few already. I'm not going to mention all of them here, Rana, but I'm just going to highlight some of those that have been particularly influential in terms of Professor Mitter's work. A Bitter Revolution, China's Struggle with the Modern World, which is his survey of 20th century China, and probably the best one that is available now, was published in 2004. His book, Forgotten Ally, as it was published under the title of here, Forgotten Ally, China's World War II, published in 2013, is certainly the most distinguished history of China's World War II, the anti-Japanese war, as most Chinese will know it as, and one that has had a tremendous reception when it came out. And most recently, a book entitled China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism, which came out now almost 2 years ago. Now, that last book, I think, sets some of the background for the lecture today, at least in terms of some of the questions asked. And I must say, when I read that book, I saw it as a tremendous success because it was able to do many things at the same time. It was able to present an updated history of how many Chinese view the anti-Japanese war, we know as the Second World War, but it was also able to deal with memory and identification and project that forward to today in terms of how the memory of that war and the identities created by that play an influence, have a strong influence today. Our colleague here at Yale, Jay Winter, wrote in a review of the book that, and I quote Jay, "Mitter shows movingly what Chinese people sing about and weep about when they turn their minds to the devastating contours of the Second World War. Equally at home in provincial museums, internet chat rooms, and China's foreign ministry, Mitter is a sure guide to China's ongoing reassessment of the war and post-war. His brilliant account," Jay says, "shows how nation has replaced class in the moral narrative China has constructed to frame its national project." And I think that's a really good summing up of the strengths and the significance of the book. So Rana in his work is first and foremost, I would argue, a student of Chinese nationalism in its various forms, starting out with his early work on Manchuria and then going all the way up to his work on Chinese politics in the 21st century. And as many people he will know, some better than me, dealing with concepts of Chinese nationalism is a really difficult topic. And I'm sure we're going to hear more about that today. Rana has really put his stamp on the historical discussion and historiographical discussion, but also the contemporary discussion about the format, the significance, and the role of Chinese nationalism. And he's been able to do that because he's not just an historian doing fantastic work at Oxford. Rana is also a leading British public intellectual, not just on issues relating to China, but on issues of history and contemporary international affairs in general. And the impact that he has had on this has been tremendous. Having taught in Britain for a very long time, and even after coming to this country, I'm amazed to see how many people you've influenced, including a lot of people who do not work on China, in terms of how they understand the contemporary world. So we are really very lucky to have you working in this field. I picked up just before you came here, I was trying to put together this presentation, Rana, and I found a recent interview with you where you outlined how you got interested in China in the first place. And I just wanted to quote a bit of that in conclusion. So you say in this interview, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, China was a tremendously remote place in terms of British perceptions. India has always, for imperial reasons, been the Asian connection that's been stronger in Britain. So this was a combination of a very challenging but interesting language. I can certainly subscribe to that. But also a culture that perhaps had as little to do with the things I'd grown up with as could possibly be imagined. And although in later decades China has come much closer to us, that was by no means obvious. So it was a leap in the dark, but not one that I've regretted at any point since. Well, neither have we, Rana, who've followed your work and learned from your work over now quite a long career in the study of China. I think it is a most fortuitous choice that you made back then. For all of those of us who have benefited from your writing, from both your early books and the books that you produced most recently, it might not have been an immediate choice at the time, but it certainly was a good one. So with that, let us all welcome Professor Rana Mitter to Yale.
Before I do anything else in this COVID age, I should ask Richard, is this bottle of water for my use or? Excellent. Very good indeed. Always best to check on these matters. Could I start by saying thank you very much to everyone who has come in person to this event, and I know these days that agreeing to come in person to an event has its own frisson around it, so I'm very grateful that you have all chosen to join us this afternoon. And could I also start, if I may, with a couple of thanks. I'm very grateful to the committee who chose me to give the Edward H. Hume Memorial Lecture. I know, having looked at some of the history, that not only was Edward Hume himself clearly one of the many distinguished Yale graduates who made their mark in and connected to China, but also I felt suitably humbled by the range of very distinguished scholars who have given this beforehand. So I am aware of the honour that is done to me by inviting me here for that. I'd also like to thank Richard Sosa, Stephanie Kim, and all the others who have done the rather complex arrangements to actually bring someone from Britain to America, something which used to be quite simple to arrange, but now has its own complexities. I'd also like, if I may, to say briefly a word to two scholars. One is my very old friend, Professor Arne Westad, whose work I think, frankly, most of the field of modern history have been learning from for the last 25 to 30 years. Not to remind you, Arne, about how long you've been educating us all for, but I think it is fair to say that in terms of everything from the history of post-war China, a subject on which today I'm going to touch with, and I hope in some ways engage with some of the agendas that Arne has challenged our field with, but also well beyond that in terms of the global Cold War and a whole variety of what we might call the history of our own era, a field in which Rana, I think, is genuinely an unmatched historian. His departure from the UK a few years ago was a great loss to us, but it was an immense gain not only to Yale, but also, I think, to the wider field on which he is now able to stride. I'd also like to, if I may, give a brief word to a scholar who is not here, but I think is here in a wider sense, and that is, of course, the late Jonathan Spence. I only met Jonathan Spence a couple of times. One, I'm glad to say, was actually here at Yale University when he was kind enough to come and listen to a talk that I gave. But I have told many times before, and will very briefly tell the story of, in that early phase that Rana mentioned, when I was thinking as a schoolboy in England, what subject I might wish to study at university. One of the books that fell to my hand, in fact, the first book that I ever read in Chinese history was The Gate of Heavenly Peace, The Chinese and Their Revolution, the sweeping panoramic story of what I now think of, I didn't know it then, but what I now think of as the May 4th generation and the revolution that they made. And I still have that rather battered penguin copy, which I bought in a bookstore in Brighton, England, quite easily to hand in the study that I have today. I've realized to my horror probably something like 3.5 decades after I bought it. So although, of course, Jonathan Spence is no longer with us here at Yale, he is, of course, someone whose reputation will live for a very long time in the field, and I'm personally very glad to have learned from him also. So a lot to live up to today, and I will do my best, but forgive me if following in the footsteps of various giants, I may stumble now and then. But I think we should start, if I may, with some of the bigger events that have been shaping understanding of Chinese history in the last few weeks and months, before we return to a period slightly longer ago. And this is where I hope that the technology is going to allow us to follow this. Yes, there we are. Particularly in this audience, you may have paid some attention to the promulgation of the resolution on certain questions in the party's history that was passed through the 6th plenum of the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing and officially announced just a few months ago, in fact in November of 2021. You will have seen, if so, that the resolution does certain things. It seals the historical status, as one sees in the posters here, of Xi Jinping as China's leader, placing him in a very direct and high-profile trajectory from Mao Zedong through Deng Xiaoping, again, all of them portrayed, as you see there in the poster on the right-hand side, and then through the other leaders, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, onto Xi Jinping. Those two previous leaders, though, Mao and Deng, were the only ones associated with previous such resolutions in the party's history. One was, of course, the more recent, Deng Xiaoping, back in 1981, just 40 or 41 years ago, whose resolution essentially was an admission of at least partial responsibility for the Cultural Revolution. But the previous resolution, all the way back in 1945, was promulgated just as the war with Japan was coming to an end. And it helped Mao Zedong to confirm the leadership of his party, which had been a work in process, but very much consolidating by that time. And that, of course, was a resolution that also laid down the ground even before the civil war that would eventually bring Mao and his party to victory. And I want to turn back to that date in particular, to 1945, and talk a little bit about how I think that that moment should be rediscovered in terms of understanding not only, I think, some of the significance of the history of that moment, but also where it links to the present day. And I want to do that by putting forward an argument that the factors that underpinned the struggle for order and the means of achieving that order have important parallels for a story that emerges at that time, but which we are still living with in a different form in the present day. And that is the story of the rise of a global China. And a China that thinks about itself and thinks about its place in the world in some very particular ways. And for reasons of organisation and convenience, but I hope ones that will make some sense, I've divided that into 3 areas of examination, all of which conveniently begin with the letter I: internationalism, ideology, and identity. And the moment, the period, the era in which I want to place them is a period that I've started to call the Chinese post-war. This is, of course, a reference to the years after World War II, but it's also an attempt to try and popularize the use of the term post-war, in other words, post-Second World War, post-anti-Japanese war, in the Chinese context, in a way that is entirely mainstream and uncontroversial in the European context, as the late Tony Judt, for one, would have put forward, and of course in the form Sengo in the Japan history field, where it's been a well-known term. The Chinese equivalent Zhanhou has, of course, existed for a long time, but it doesn't have quite, I think, the capacity to encompass a range of ideas about a period, as opposed to a literal statement of the period itself, in a way that those other terms do. And so I am putting it forward at this point. It is, of course, a period about which Rana Mitter has written with immense distinction, the period of the Chinese Civil War, 1946 to 1950. And if you didn't think the Chinese Civil War went on until 1950, you should check out Hainan Island, where, of course, it did last until quite late into that year. But I would say that also, of course, it is much more than the period of the Chinese Civil War, devastating and central though that was. It was also the time when China moved into the first phase of its engagement with the post-war international order. And I speak, of course, today on a day when, largely to do with events in Eastern Europe rather than East Asia, the nature of that post-war order, already somewhat fragile for good reasons, is becoming even more in question as the hours and the days go by. It's also, of course, a moment when China sought a new definition of its own sovereignty as a founder member of the United Nations and, of course, a permanent member of the newly formed Security Council. It was also a time when China became embroiled in some of the biggest global debates about the links between economic and social development. It was also a time when ideological concerns did, I think, come to the forefront. There were huge debates in China in those post-war years about what democracy might actually mean in the Chinese context. And of course, huge debates about what relationship, if any, that type of democracy had to the growing and ultimately inexorable forces in China's deep countryside. In other words, it was a time when some of the debates were remarkably similar to those of today, and in other important ways, remarkably different. The China of Xi Jinping, I should be clear, is not, in any argument that I will make, the same as the China that Mao Zedong took over in 1949. Today's China is global in reach, whereas that China was recovering from the aftermath of 2 huge wars, first with Japan and then, of course, between the Chinese themselves. Today's China is, I think, indubitably a consumerist society. The earlier version was very much about austerity. Today's China is an innovator in technology. That earlier version was desperate to find support, whether from the Soviets or from the Americans, to create its own ecology of development that will become autonomous over time, but could not start in that way. So the differences are clear. But the continuities do matter. To understand why that would be, you just have to look at the process that was going on to produce the resolution on the party's history. And the key word in that, perhaps unsurprisingly, is the word history. In other words, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, cares deeply that its own version of its own story of origin is dominant, without any of the nasty bumps in the road, vicious intra-party massacres, the famine, the Great Leap Forward, the turmoil of the Cultural Revolution, that in practice have been part of the historical nexus of events that have brought it to power. And you can see that. I won't go through the whole thing, you'll be glad to know, but here are a few key quotes from the authorized English translation of the original text as issued. And I go into that detail because although we have a relatively limited time today, I think it is fair to say that that history is becoming of increasing interest both in China itself and in the wider world. And actually, in some ways, the interest is a bifurcated one. One is a series of questions of interest within the historical profession. And in today's comments, when I get to some detail in just a moment, I think it is fair to say that those debates are ones that I think historians are primarily concerned with and which I think can help us rethink beyond China this period of global history. But the other set of concerns is very much an engagement with the ideas that shape China's contemporary politics. And I give you this short, if somewhat dense, extract from the party resolution of 2021, simply to point out that the Chinese Communist Party, in its present incarnation, however future-oriented, however keen it is on creating a forward-looking socio-economic contract, is still immensely concerned with the way in which its past is constructed in its own eyes and in the eyes of others. So, to give you some illustration of how that continuity as well as change works, I've drawn on historical materials relating to various individuals with, I think, important insights into the geopolitical and ideological change during that period. I'm not going to talk today very much about the very, what you might kind of call top tier of leaders, Mao Zedong, Chiang Kai-shek and others. I've written about them elsewhere, and there are many others who have done wonderful work on what they were doing during this period. Instead, I want to draw on some voices that I think are less well known, although I think they are quite central in terms of what they illustrate to the dynamics of that post-war moment in China. And I have to confess, I've chosen them also because they allowed me to indulge what I personally have found one of the most rewarding parts of examination of historical development during this time, which is the diaries kept by very large numbers of figures, not only of world historical importance, but also of quite local, inward-looking importance. Day after day, I think Rana may agree that historians of China give thanks for the Confucian tendencies that led very large numbers of Chinese, even into the mid-20th century, to keep very extensive diaries of their own thoughts and doings. And those have been very valuable to all of us who want to reconstruct that particular past. And I will here show a couple of pictures of two of the figures who I wanted to bring up. On the left-hand side, a figure, I've said he was sort of less famous than some of the others, but actually at the time pretty distinguished, Wang Shijie, during the time that I'm talking about, the foreign minister of China, but also a constitutional lawyer, one of that extraordinary generation of young Chinese, almost all, but not entirely, but almost all men who were sent to study overseas, mostly in the United States, some of them in Britain, and who became fluent not just in English and Chinese, but actually fluent in two world views as well. And I think that that is something which, until recently, has been forgotten and perhaps underappreciated. On the right-hand side, drawing actually here on memoirs rather than diaries, but I think very, very vivid ones in many ways, is Zheng Zhi. During the post-war years, she was a young communist activist. She joined the revolution when she was just 15 years old in Hunan province. She spent most of the next 20 years essentially on the run. She was a powerful actor in her own right, but I should observe she also became married to a figure who became very senior in the CCP, Politburo Standing Committee member Tao Zhu, who came to a pretty harrowing end during the Cultural Revolution, in fact. And these figures, I think, are amongst those who illustrate some of the wider points that I wanted to make. Wang Shijie himself, as he observed in his diaries, the period of, first of all, hope and then despair of the last years of the Kuomintang nationalists in government, as first of all, observing a period where all sorts of new possibilities had opened up for China, but also one where the country was deeply vulnerable. Bear in mind that in 1945, at the time of the Japanese surrender, China was simultaneously both stronger and weaker than it had been at any time in a century. Stronger because it had the prestige of being a victorious Allied power alongside the British, the Americans, the Soviets, and of course the French, and full sovereignty essentially for the first time since 1843 because of wartime treaties that had been signed to end various restrictions on its sovereignty. But at the same time, weak beyond imagining because it was a country that over the 8 years of the war against the Japanese had been destroyed by bombing, refugee flight, and financial and economic disaster. Zheng Zhi and other comrades of hers saw this post-war period as a time of ideological refashioning, when previous assumptions about mentalities had to be rethought. It was not enough to rebuild China's railways and roads. You had to refashion its people as well. And today, the reason I bring this up is that today it's become quite commonplace to look at much of China's language, political language, official language, particularly at a time when it really matters to know what the official mind of China thinks and says. And from a Western point of view, quite often that language, particularly when translated directly into English, sounds either highly laden with jargon, or very saccharine, or very, very confrontational, or indeed aggressive. And one of the things that I think, going back to some of that period of birth and development of that sort of political language, is a reminder that, yes, it is highly constructed language, but that does not make it inauthentic language. And I think the connection between those two is very important in terms of understanding what people at that time thought they were doing, rather than what we think they may have been doing at the time, as I will hope to show you. Early on in his tenure as foreign minister, he served from 1945 August to 1948. Wang Shijie became part of the Chinese negotiation team with none other than the man that Rana calls the boss in his books, Joseph Stalin. It was pretty much a baptism, if it was a baptism of sorts, of fire. Imagine your first diplomatic negotiation being with Stalin on the other end. Wang Shijie knew that it was going to be a pretty fierce sort of encounter, and as he got on the plane to head to Moscow, he kept a little phrase that his daughter had written for him. And although the diaries are in Chinese, he was a fluent speaker of English, and some phrases were in English. And this one, his daughter had also written in English for him, and that was the phrase, "Don't be afraid of opposition. Remember, a kite flies against, not with the wind." And that was the source of my title for today. But I chose it because I think it was a very appropriate metaphor for an immensely turbulent time. Let me, before I start getting into some of the detail of what Wang Shijie, Zheng Zhi, and others were saying at this time, I'm sure with this expert audience we don't need much of this, but let me take about 90 seconds, I hope, just to give a very, very quick overview of some of the milestones historically that we see in China during this time. And as I've said, but we'll say again, if you want more details, you can't do better than to check out Cold War and Revolution and Decisive Encounters, two books by Rana, who has pioneered this particular field. But during those 5 very, very crowded years, it's worth noting that the war, which China fought with Japan since 1937, came to an end. Negotiations between the nationalists and the Kuomintang and the Soviets led to a Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship in August 1945 that was essentially an attempt, amongst other things, by the Chinese nationalists to close off the Soviets, to give them certain concessions in return for them not attempting further support of their communist Chinese allies or further territorial demands, which included, of course, at that time, incursions into Xinjiang, as well as into Manchuria. China also, during this time, becomes one of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. China, of course, has been permanently on that council ever since, although, of course, for a couple of decades as Taiwan rather than as the mainland until 1971. And also during this time, you see the increasingly fraught coalition negotiations that begin in 1945-46. General Marshall, George Marshall, spent most of 1946 ultimately vainly trying to get a ceasefire and coalition government between the communists and nationalists before that broke down. You then have 1946-49, a vicious civil war between the two sides. At first, there was a plausible argument that the Kuomintang, that the nationalists, could somehow consolidate and destroy the CCP's political and military base, but a variety of factors turned the tide, everything from improved communist battle tactics under Lin Biao and others, to the destruction of the morale and economic base of the Kuomintang through poor military choices and economic chaos. Eventually, the end of the story, of course, is well known. Chiang Kai-shek flees to Taiwan, and the communists conquer the mainland by 1949, with Hainan Island following the next year. So that is the main narrative of the Civil War and the immensely important backdrop to other events. But I want to put that, if one can do that, slightly aside for a little bit, because it seems to me that we sometimes act as if a phase in China's foreign relations ends in 1949 and starts again from zero. So from Mao's China, the turn to the Soviet Union, the split from the United States, made final by the Korean War, and the continued presence of the ROC Taiwan in the United Nations until the 1970s. And in that version of history, I'm caricaturing slightly, but not all that much in some ways, 1945 to 49 is a sort of stub. It's an afterthought. It's unfinished business that finally gets wrapped up, but isn't of huge importance in its own right. And I'd want to challenge that. I think although a lot did start again, evidently, in 1949, some important elements, including China's engagement with the United Nations and the rivalry between Taipei and Beijing, which emerged to make links with other non-Western states, remained highly relevant across that 1949 boundary. And what makes Wang Shijie, the foreign minister of China, interesting in that time, is the thread of things being taken up, or being set up, that would not be taken up by him in the immediate short term, but would later come back to become a very important part of China's self-presentation in that later era of global engagement under the CCP. I'm talking about territorial claims, maritime and land-based, and the wider projection of China as a power with regional and even global ambitions. So in his first year in office, 1945 to 46, Wang Shijie became part of at least three major negotiations. The first was the meeting with Stalin in Moscow to bring about the Sino-Soviet Treaty of 1945. The second was his presence as part of that team negotiating with American support for the coalition government between the communists and the nationalists. But the third set of discussions related to areas that have been less covered and analysed up to now. And they relate in particular to Wang Shijie's attempts at a fluid time in geopolitics to stake a claim for China as a global player in the post-war world. To steal the famous words of US Secretary of State Dean Acheson, slightly avant la lettre because he wasn't actually Secretary of State at that point, not just to be present at the creation, but also to take a stronger role in doing the creating of an order that would stretch across continents. Bear in mind that Wang Shijie, like most Chinese officials and elites, whether nationalist or communist, absolutely believed that China's titanic sacrifices, including the 10 million or more war dead through a variety of causes, military death, of course, but famine and disease as well, and of course China's refusal to surrender to Japan in 1938, their belief that these events had changed the war and that the world now had a debt of honour to China. And this led to a whole variety of approaches, some at the more seemingly quixotic end of what might be geopolitically possible. In other words, Wang's pushing of the idea of China being a power that might not just reshape Asia, and I'll say more about that in a moment, but also Europe as well. And Wang Shijie pushed repeatedly for China to get a place at that table of European negotiation. That was, as I say, at the further end of his ambition at the time. More achievable in the short term was a desire to find a new mode of engagement with other countries in the emergent non-Western post-colonial world. China saw itself potentially as a mentor to many of them, but also, of course, in the case of countries like India in particular, a rival or an alternative leader. And Wang's daily negotiations show many aspects of those, as we will see. The principle that if the West could still make decisions for Asia in 1945, as indeed it was doing in Vietnam, in Malaya, in a whole variety, in Korea, in a whole variety of other, in Japan indeed, of polities in the region, then, likewise, Asia should be able to have a role in shaping the West. It might seem, as I say, an ambition beyond anything that was realistic, but its logic clearly appealed deeply to Wang Shijie's mind and indeed heart. And that led him, I will say, to some rather awkward conversations. One is illustrated, as it were, here in his engagement with the then Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. If you think that the current Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, is something of a hard case, Molotov clearly set the mold, and I think, in fact, is related through family to him, as married to the grandson, I think, or something like that. Anyway, so there's a family connection between the two, it must be said. And arriving in September 1945 at the London Foreign Ministers' Conference, one of Wang Shijie's first priorities was to try and grab some of the big foreign ministers of that time, Ernest Bevin of Britain, James Burns, the Secretary of State of the United States, and Molotov. He didn't get very far with them, but nonetheless, he pressed his case strongly where he felt he could do so, pushing the case, for instance, with Molotov, that a trusteeship for the North African colonies such as Libya, which had been left behind by Italy, should be discussed in a much more open and full way than was being planned at the time, and also various plans for the joint management, potentially, of the governance of post-war Japan. Molotov was very keen on that idea. Wang Shijie cooled on it quite quickly, realizing that to do so would almost certainly alienate the United States. But it was by no means a foolish request on the part of Molotov, since he could clearly see the attractiveness of putting forward an option that would give the Soviets more say in Japan, but would also attract China by giving them a role, as opposed to everything essentially being decided by the United States. It's clear also from the negotiations, as recorded, that Wang Shijie put forward viewpoints and thoughts that drew very much from his own and China's own experience during the past 2 decades. I think the memories of Manchuria being invaded in 1931 were very much in his mind when he argued against a proposal by the French to separate off part of northern Germany in the post-war negotiations. Wang said in his diary, "I said that it wasn't right. If the people who lived in that region didn't desire to separate from Germany, then if the people who lived in that region didn't desire to separate from Germany, I talked about the principle of nationalism, 民族主义的道理, which should not be neglected even on the territory of your enemy." Now that's an interesting statement, particularly for the foreign minister of a country that had suffered as much as China had at that point, but also a sign of the, I think, genuinely quite forward-looking thinking that was going on, not about just what had happened in terms of the immense destruction visited on China, but what the world that was coming was going to look like. He also went on very explicitly to say, his words, China could not be excluded from discussions of the Balkans or Italy. I have to say, Molotov's reply was essentially, oh yes, China can be excluded, and indeed pretty much went on to do that. But again, the point is that Wang was not simply refusing taking what he could get. He was very keen to make sure that the case was put forward, and that China's argument that it should be a power that at least had some say in global matters beyond the Asian sphere was on the record. At that point, it has to be said that Secretary Burns didn't entirely resist the idea, although part of that was clearly to do with trying to make sure that there was a sort of balance between the various powers, all of whom wanted to get a certain role. And China, inevitably, of course, was on the weaker end of that particular spectrum. The following year, when the foreign ministers met in Paris in 1946, Wang Shijie was forced by that stage, in a way that had been less necessary in 1945, to talk about and to some extent make excuses for the continuing failure of his government to resolve the Civil War situation. But his earlier lobbying did actually pay off, and China at this conference was given a certain amount of time to speak about the European situation. Wang argued that the reparations for peace treaties being drawn up mustn't be too harsh, so as to avoid, as he put it, reactionary forces in the defeated countries reviving and democratic forces being unable to rise. And again, in a moment, in a day, indeed, when the anger of powers that consider that they have been placed outside the international order is being felt just across the Atlantic in Europe at the moment, we can see once again that these sorts of sentiments from 1945-46, while at some level clearly very much tied to that historical moment, are by no means absent in terms of that wider principle of establishing order. Now, my point here is not, and there are various other things, of course, he talked about, including the question of Italy's colonies, the Soviet refusal to withdraw from Iran, and a whole variety of other factors that emerged at that time. My point here is not that China was a major actor in shaping the Balkan or Italian settlements. Clearly, it wasn't. I think that would be a point of historical revisionism too far. What I think is important is the narrative of entitlement. Whether or not he got what he wanted, Wang Xijie at that point saw no reason why he should not make a claim for China as a wartime allied victorious power to be part of the establishment of that global order. And while the point of origin and the point of justification is some ways different today, the fact that today a rather different China makes claims, not just obviously in its own backyard, but in new areas, including the Arctic, does show that the idea of China thinking of itself as a power that has global reach is something that has a much longer history than is sometimes assumed when the Belt and Road Initiative, starting 7 or 8 years ago, is thought of as a sort of year zero. In other words, China's policymakers saw this as part of a trajectory which at that time they were projecting into a world that would continue from their point of view through the 1940s, 50s and beyond. They did not know at that stage, although they quickly found out, that their own particular world would come to an end in 1949. But it didn't mean, of course, that their successors couldn't take advantage of what they had to say. And let me give an example of something closer to home from China and Wang Xijie's point of view that I think makes the point quite clearly. Because while I put forward Wang Xijie's attempts to try and influence the European settlement as perhaps the furthest reach that he might have tried in terms of making a claim for a new global China, the Asian sphere was not only an area where actually there was much greater success, even in a relatively short period, but also one where the sponsoring powers, and particularly the United States, were much happier to allow a greater Chinese role. And this became quite clear in terms of the initiatives that China took in some areas where it felt that it had newly earned rights. So let's take Wang Xijie looking a little closer to home on the Shisha, the Paracel Islands, in 1947. Now I bring this particular subject up again because, again, in this audience, I think it is fair to say that you'll be aware that the problem of Chinese claims on the South China Sea is by no means of only historical interest. I will not say anything more about rights or wrongs or yeses or nos about any present-day claims, but I will read, if I may, a short extract from his diary, the 18th of January, 1947, which says something about the way in which Wang Xijie was looking to put forward a new narrative of China's rights in Asia, in this case, pitched as an anti-colonial move. Because the power that was at that stage in the Chinese sights when it came to repossession of the islands, in this case, was colonial France, which wanted to reclaim these particular islands essentially as part of their Vietnamese colony. And Wang Xijie wrote in his diary, "We've always claimed the Shisha archipelago as our territory." So there's grist to the mill of today's PRC making historical claims on the seas. But Wang Xijie continues, "But we've never yet set up officials or sent workers to stay there on a regular basis." And again, in the present day, as you'll know, there's lots of debates about whether or not these islands have been inhabited and having people actually live on them. "The French government recognizes it," he says, "as Vietnamese territory. After Japan's surrender, we sent a small number of troops to the important island at the heart of the archipelago, it's called Woody Island, to occupy it. Recently, the French have sent a military ship to the island to scare our troops resident there, but after my intervention, they withdrew. This is going to be a dispute between China and France." Well, I can say that last sentence probably has not come out as being the major historical element that was ultimately of importance. But all the rest of that, I think, does indicate the way in which the claims and the desire to reorder the Asian sphere that was in China's influence was very much at the heart of the Kuomintang project in the immediate post-war, well before the communist victory in 1949. And that happened again, doesn't happen out of context. It happens during months and years when a whole variety of different visitors come to Nanjing, the Chinese capital, to negotiate for a new order in Asia. In 1946, the former Thai Prime Minister, Priti Banongyom, visits after the treaty with Thailand. As Wang said, the first time an important key figure from Thailand has visited China in this way. April 1947 was quite busy. Syngman Rhee came in from Korea. As Wang said, his thinking is a bit conservative, which I think is a bit of an understatement, but it's a some fair analysis. But his spirit of struggle is very strong, and he was rather a fan of Rhee. And then the Philippines, despite the disputes over South China Sea more broadly speaking, in this case, a treaty of friendship is set up between the Chinese and the Philippine government just after the Philippines gain independence. In other words, much more of the configuration of order is being done by Asians with other Asians at this point than has perhaps been appreciated, not to the exclusion of the superpower conflict that emerges at that time, and not to the exclusion of the horrific domestic turmoil that is tearing China apart, but at the same time. And it's the confluence of these particular forces that I think deserves further examination in terms of their simultaneous actions. So let me move on from that point, if I may, for the last section of what I want to do, to talk about a rather different area of engagement. I have been ranging in the last quarter of an hour or so in terms of this attempt to try and rewrite a little bit the geopolitical project of China in this immediate post-war era. But I now want to sort of almost zoom in the other direction and look very much inside hearts and minds to understand what was going on in terms of changing in political thinking at this particular sense. And that's where I bring together what I've called the other two I's, the ideology and the identity of what's going on. And again, not that everything in the past should reflect the present, but at a time when huge amounts of effort is spent on reading Chinese documents, Chinese social media, I should say actually CSIS in Washington, D.C., I believe, is just about to start a major new online project in terms of analysis of key Chinese documents, which has actually a very 1960s air to it, for those of us who know where the field emerged from, although I personally wasn't around, I have to say, during that particular moment. But that idea, in other words, that you can read an awful lot into how people construct language, particularly Marxist phrases and language, is, I think, one that has a much longer and very interesting history. In other words, we know a great deal about ideology in terms of what was taught to converts to a particular ideological cause, but sometimes I think the missing link is to see how detailed the socialization was of that belief into links to objective reality. I realize I'm sounding quite Marxist here, but what I meant was that these linguistic changes and ways of thinking do not happen in a vacuum. I mean, how could they happen in a vacuum? They happen in the context of historical events. And people use political terms and language, constructed language that comes from elsewhere, to shape their own lived subjective experience. And, terms like lived subjective experience, again, jargon for academics. We're talking here about extraordinary people. Let's go back to Zheng Zhi, who I showed you at the beginning. So as I said, at the age of 15, in 1926, she went on to she joined a turbulent life that went on and on in underground CCP politics. In her own words, she was, quotes, a career revolutionary. She killed her first landlord with a spear through his stomach in 1927. That's an interesting part of her memoirs, I can tell you. And she sat within a grouping, a generation of people of different ages and different stages, all of whom became part of this new and transformative political project. A couple more here, maybe known to you possibly, but in case not. On the left-hand side, Yang Si, a cadre at this time in the post-war years, in his 40s, mostly based in Zhejiang in east-central China, mid-level officer, not super high, but not a junior guy either. And on the right-hand side there, Liu Yanjin, the youngest of any of these people, born in 1925, just in her early 20s, as the 1949 revolution approached. Let's have a look at some of the diary entries of Yang Si, who again does historians a huge favour by writing, not quite day to day, but certainly every few days, as he is engaged in the campaign that ultimately becomes part of the victorious campaign for the conquest of the mainland. And one of the things that's very obvious from what he writes at the time is that there was nothing natural, nothing automatic about local people becoming attracted to the CCP. Now, historians might say on the one hand that actually it's fairly obvious there's nothing natural about that sort of thing, but of course there is so much language about the idea of the masses being naturally attracted to this transformative social force that swept away the hated Kuomintang. You know, you can fill in the words for yourself. It's well worth noting that the day-to-day experience was clearly often quite different. One of many very interesting entries from October 1945 is when Yang Si takes part in a count of personnel and weapons because so many people are deserting at that point from the base area that he's in Zhejiang as part of the newly formed communist armies. They end up at that particular point with several hundred people out of about 2,000 troops deserting. Yang observing, as he says, because of the changes in their life situation, in other words, being recruited and placed in this military formation, everyone got quite worried. And then he adds the following note. The majority are good comrades. There are many reasons for such a serious reduction of numbers, by which he means desertion. But the leaders and the section chiefs have not united. The warlord residue of their leadership style and their emotional complicity, i.e. dragging people basically into projects that they don't fully agree with or approve of, are the main reasons. The military leaders and the political commanders don't get on well. And of course, the question of political links and military links in the top leadership, but also the kind of next levels down of the People's Liberation Army as it formed under that name and reformed itself, is one of the most interesting things in terms of how you bring together often very disparate groups of people and turn them into an effective fighting force, but also political force. So he says the military leaders and the political commanders don't get on well, and this reflects abnormality between the party and the masses. And I think that's both an interesting and indeed quite honest statement, because much of what then takes place, and this is 1945, as you see, what happens during much of the next 2, 3, 4 years is a continuing attempt to try and make sure that there is some way in which, as the military situation improves, the political socialization of those both in the PLA and associated with the PLA becomes much stronger. Because their point of contrast, of course, is the increasing collapse of the Kuomintang armies, and the records that we have from people recruited in those at lower levels are very much of increasing realization of lack of organization, corruption, and failure to ultimately achieve their various ends. And the monitoring of the political, ideological, and indeed emotional temperature of the charges of a PLA officer like Yang Si is, of course, very different in all sorts of obvious ways from the process of Rudang entering into the party in the present day. But the overall aim, the aim to try and make sure that the political and the emotional and the professional are brought together, is in some ways a very, very similar one, even though today, for the most part, it's not in a military context, even though, of course, the ethos of militarization is one of the things that we have noted has become much stronger in Chinese civil society and the media sphere in the last few years. And Yang Si himself also did something that, again, from what we know about party practice today, is still very current, which is self-reflection. His partner was a performer in the entertainment division of the PLA, and the relationship is not always going terribly well. And he writes about himself in his diary, I suddenly felt kind of that my life was very narrow and quite depressing. He says, these petit bourgeois feelings, being too thick or too intense, it's not good. I want to change that in myself. Now, to those of us sitting here in an Anglophone country in the 2020s, talking about your own petit bourgeois feelings sounds, at best artificial and possibly even, slightly ludicrous. The point here is that for someone who was feeling something that was clearly emotionally quite genuine, in this context, the appropriate way to express it was through a particular type of, as in this case, Marxist-influenced political language that helped him to both express and process and justify what it is that he wanted to do. And this became a much more common practice throughout the whole of the political project of that particular era. In mid-July of that year, 1946, Young reflected further on what he called his two big flaws. And he says, "When someone hurts my petit bourgeois self-regard, I lose patience, or at least I feel unhappy inside." The answer, as far as he was concerned, was, as he put it, political study and daily self-reflection, which combines both Marxism and Confucianism, I think, in a kind of effective way. And the idea, of course, of Xiuyang, which Liu Shaoqi, amongst other top communists, was very, very keen on, is, of course, in many ways an inheritance of that Confucian learning, which many of the older leaders of the CCP had gone through at that time. At one point, as Yang Ziyi puts it, he says, "We should read books just as often as we sweep the floor." And with a rather Mao-like analogy to bodily function, he then adds, this is Yang again, "I feel that my petit bourgeois weakness and self-regard is like the stinkiness of my toes. It's hard to wash away." So while I have no direct primary evidence of what Yang Ziyi's socks were like, I think at least we can assume that they may have been a little overly ideologically fervid in this particular case. Let me give you also a few thoughts from Liu Yanjin, the young woman, born in 1923, a member actually also of one of those CCP military performance troops, and deeply in love with a man who actually became a rather famous Chinese movie director, Ling Zifeng, who then married someone else. And the diary, it is a contemporary diary, is very moving in many ways, but also you can tell that it's written by someone in her 20s at a moment of deep emotional distress. One of the moments that she found very, very inspiring, though, was the aftermath of the Japanese defeat, where she says, "Taika pala," oh boy, oh, amazing. Faced with this victory, she's writing to herself, she refers to herself in the second person. She says, "The party needs you to advance more quickly, take on more glorious tasks. It does not need your pessimistic sighing." And later on, she writes that, in her case, "My petit bourgeois romantic fantasies and inappropriate thoughts should be put on the shelf." And she cites there actually an often quoted, slightly misquoted take, which is the Leninist theory of the glass of water, which you may know, which is basically a kind of slightly parodied version that then put forward the thoughts of Alexandra Kollontai, one of the early feminist Bolshevik thinkers, that supposedly love and relationship should be as ordinary as drinking a glass of water or drinking from a bottle was. In other words, in a truly socialist society, it wouldn't become the source of this huge romantic petit bourgeois source of distress or overly emotional work that it is in a petit bourgeois society. This is in fact a slight parody, to be honest, of what Kollontai said, but that's not so important in this particular case. And yet, when Liu Yanjin's love affair goes horribly wrong, when her intended marries someone else, she writes a furious entry in her diary at the time, and I think on International Women's Day, in fact, in March 1946. And amongst the things that she writes, along the kind of things that you might expect from someone who's been deeply hurt in love, such as, "What kind of demon is troubling your mind?" She says, "Why don't you have a Bolshevik morality about love? You should use a robust party spirit to evaluate yourself." Now, I don't know if you would write to your angry lover, I'm not asking, words in those terms. But again, the fact that at this time, in this place, in this era, for a 20-something young woman, deeply, deeply steeped in the way in which the party is recasting its cadres, to use this language about something that's deeply personal to her and deeply, deeply felt, and not in any sense inauthentic, and yet, of course, encased in what we would regard as Marxist jargon, is a sign of how important this recasting of language was in terms of people's self-definition. Let me conclude, if I may, with a few thoughts at the end here about where I think some of this comes together. People make propaganda and ideology, to misquote Marx, but they do not make it exactly as they please. In other words, it's not enough just to understand, as we must do, that the Kuomintang, during the period that we're talking about, become immensely downhearted, someone like Wang Shijie, who we started with just very briefly in 1947, he keeps writing things such as, I feel extremely gloomy about the future of the current political situation, and the core people in our party don't have any genuine conviction when it comes to democracy and constitutional government. The CCP diarists of that time have lots of quite problematic things to say, as I mentioned, which will probably mean that they would be guilty of historical nihilism in the present day. But they don't say that sort of thing. There's a genuine emotional register of difference between the two sides. But beyond that, we have to understand how that ideological fulfillment and sense of self-creation links to an objective reality. And consideration of today's nationalist propaganda and Marxist language, and there's plenty of it in China today, is often treated as if it's free-floating and in some ways disconnected from social realities. But I think that is no more true in the 2020s than it was in the 1940s, or indeed vice versa. Language that's used today, whether it's about communities of common destiny or the desire for China to be a 21st century Marxist society, is mostly quite inwardly directed. It is for a Chinese audience. But I think it is still a reminder, the fact that it doesn't translate very well into English or into an international audience, which is one of the reasons that it doesn't tend to get used much in China's outward propaganda, is nonetheless a useful and necessary reminder that the liberal subject is not the norm in all societies at all times. In other words, we can't just translate the documents, important though they are. We need to understand the reception of that language and the use of it to construct identities in certain ways that still have a great deal of power. That, in the end, I think, is why that post-war moment, 1945 to 1949, is, I think, increasingly relevant to the moment that China is in today. As you see the list that I have here, I won't go through every single one of them, but in terms of some of the practical reasons why I think the late 1940s has an importance for the presence of the trajectory of China today, its role at the UN, its territorial issues, the idea of China as a global actor, a time of ideological revolutionary renewal and identity, ideas of economic development, moral balance, the idea of China as a World War II victor that gives it a right in the world today. All of these are things that I think in practical terms are important in linking the two periods. But I think also, more conceptually, the post-war era has one other element that is reflected in something that is very relevant to today's language. It too was on the cusp of a new era, one that defined politics or redefined politics in very significant ways. And Xi Jinping, of course, also has defined his period in power as a new era, albeit one that simultaneously seeks some kind of continuity with the founding of the party back in 1921, as the resolution of last November put forward. And remembering that in China, of all places, the politics of the future is very closely linked to interpretations of the recent and quite distant past, is, I think, one of the many ideas that we can draw from, to me, that very fascinating, if very short, post-war period. Thank you all very much for your attention, and delighted to have some discussion now, Rana. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful, wonderful presentation, Rana. Lots of things to discuss. While people gather their questions, gather their thoughts, I find my glasses so I can see who wants to be heard. I remember when I first started looking for and then finding Wang Shijie's diaries in the, I think the Jindai Shoyan Yusu at Academia Sinica. I thought I had this was for my PhD dissertation, I thought I'd had a major breakthrough when I was finally able to locate them and then get the family's permission to actually use them. And I came very excited to the library one morning and discovered that all or most of them are written in Zaozi, so in grasped script, which as a graduate student I found, even more so now as a professor I guess, I found really difficult to decipher. So I had to call on the help of others to try to instruct me the particular writing style that he used for his diary. But when I did get through it, I was struck by just how fascinating those, and how personal those diaries are in many ways, much of which was written, of course, when he held high political office. But they are not just reflecting his political positions and his political participation, they're also really very introspective in terms of what they contribute. Maybe I could start you off with a question on that, actually.
Of course.
Because our connecting to the whole issue of identity that you bring up here. So one of the things that I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about, both when I was writing on this time period, but particularly later on, is the preoccupation with the restitution of China after the end of the anti-Japanese war as a kind of decolonization that you see presented both by Republican leaders and by communist leaders. And this is extremely interesting in many ways, both because it links China to a broader world of decolonization that was taking place at the same time. But it's also really striking in the sense that this is in many ways, the remnants of an empire, in the sense that both the Republic of China and the People's Republic took over borders that were remarkably similar to those of the Qing Empire, that is connecting itself to the issue of decolonization. So in other words, it is the decolonization by others that needs to be undertaken. There is relatively little self-reflection in terms of what actually constitutes the republic that Wang Zhidue and others served with such eminence. So I wonder if that is also part of the identity challenge in a way here, then, and perhaps also now, in terms of the use of concepts, not least in legal terms, the imagination or the imaginary of what this new China should be.
It's a great question, Arno, thank you. I think one of the best case studies, which indeed is mentioned in Wang Zhijue's diary, but has a kind of wider purchase as well, is an event which I think you know, I think you know more about than most people, I think, but which is the independence referendum for Outer Mongolia that takes place very early in late 1945. And I think many here will know, just to say, it was organized by Stalin, on Stalin's behalf, and it had a rather miraculous result, I think, of sort of 437,000 people in Mongolia voted for independence, and 0 people voted against it, which was quite... Not a single one, so it was entirely free and fair in every way. I'm sure there was soon to be a similar vote in Luhansk and various other places too as well. But why is this interesting? Because apart from the astonishing nature of the vote, which clearly was a gesture of contempt by Stalin in a sense towards the Chinese Republic in that case, because for a very long time the Republic of China had continued to maintain its claim that was lost in 1911 at the end of the Qing to Outer Mongolia, as well as which had gone essentially to become a sort of Soviet satellite state, as a territory that would have to be restored to the Republic in a way that Taiwan and various other places would do as well. And essentially, of course, it has become the only one of those territories to which the Chinese state has essentially given up its claim during that period. And one of the reasons, it seems to me, is that a lot of the wider discussion during that period is about what you can, essentially what you can save as part of a kind of central idea of what the Chinese Republic is going to be and what has to be let go. And having to let go of Mongolia essentially is a price that, you know, they can't be avoided. And Wang Zhijie himself knows it's going to be very, very difficult for to get past the the press and some of the more firebrand members of the Nationalist Party who don't want to let it go too. But because there's a concern in particular that the northeast and the northwest, so Xinjiang and Dongbei, Manchuria, are going to come under threat, and in other words, sort of eat away at that wider territorial vision of China, it's put forward as a sacrifice that must be made to save the rest in that sense. There isn't much sense, I think, or at least I have seen very little sense of the idea that there should be some reckoning with China's own record in terms of this period. And I'm not entirely surprised, simply because one of the things that I hope I've drawn with the picture here, and I think is evident in a sense when one looks at it, is that there are so many different defensive elements of trying to construct this state at the same time, and even these attempts to, in a sense, the appeals to Molotov and to Burns and to turn up in Paris and London and say, we should be saying what goes on with Italy's colonies, is actually part of that exercise too. You know, it's part of this sort of wider claim that actually there is this new entity that is a post-war China that has a right to do this, that, and the other. I think there's also, and this I'm stretching slightly because I don't at the moment have a particular quote I could put my hand on to do that, although perhaps I should look for one. But I suspect there's a strong feeling that if the British and the French do not resile in any sense from their empires, and you know, India aside, they really don't during this period. And that is something that is observed quite strongly by the Chinese during this period. Then the sense that looking at the mote in their own eye is a useful task at this point, I think is probably not something that's regarded as a great political priority at this particular stage. But I mean, I think you're right that it is while there is lots of insight on various things, the sense of reflexiveness on the nature of what exactly the Republic is supposed to be almost isn't given enough space to breathe during that time, I think.
It is quite remarkable when you think about it, connected to other periods of transition of the Great Wars. I mean, those of us who read Putin's speech in which he justifies the takeover by violence of an armed force of Ukraine, spends an enormous amount of time castigating Lenin and to some extent Stalin as well for having done just that, for thinking about Russia as an empire in which people who were not central to the empire actually had rights. But you almost never find that on the Chinese side, with Chinese communists, with those in the Chinese Republic. Okay, other questions for Professor Mitter? Yes.
Hi, Rana, thank you very much. So this non-historian facile question then. It seems to me you've skated very lightly over the fact that we're talking about nationalists, not communists in this period. You seem to make a very bold claim here about cultural continuity of the elite political situation, historical narrative and stuff, being far more important than socialist mindset, political views and everything else in making these comparisons to the 40s and the 2022. Any comments?
Actually, I thought I was rather doing the opposite, which is pointing out that actually language and mindset makes a huge amount of difference at this time, because the sort of language that you would get amongst these younger and not so young cadres is not at all the kind of language that would have been used in that form by the kind of figures on the nationalist side, who have their own political language and very strong. People like Jiang Jingguo, or indeed Wang Shijie, or Jiang Tingfu, or Chen Boulay, actually, Chiang Kai-shek's personal secretary, in a sense, who eventually takes his own life in 1948 through a combination of sort of depression that comes from personal mental health issues, but also with the kind of collapse of the regime around him at that time. But much of the language in which they express their own kind of growing sense of gloom and despair is as you would know, Chloe, very well, kind of quite traditional sort of Confucian self-presentation that's in some ways, rather rejecting of this idea of self-realization and changing through ideas that come from a Marxist framework in that sense. I think that one of the things that could do with more emphasis during this particular period, because it's one of the rare periods when you get not quite a sort of even conflict, but certainly one where there's sort of strong elements on both sides, is the way in which the post-war period is one of different sorts of political visions that are expressed in different sorts of political language to socialize the people who are putting them forward. And one of the areas that I didn't talk about partly because I thought you wouldn't all thank me for going on for 3 hours, but there's quite a lot about land reform, actually, the Tugai program during this time, where actually lots of these people are recording, first of all, really interesting things about how, again, in retrospect, it's all about the peasants, rise up against their evil oppressors. And there's actually plenty of that going on. But also, a great deal of it is spent in a way that isn't always so much stressed in communists basically giving other communists a hard time about not being sufficiently kind of indoctrinated into the program and having the right kind of the wrong kind of rightist or the right kind of leftist viewpoint as part of that. But the consequences of these things were not by any means purely abstract. They ended in real people being locked up or, hit with billhooks or, murdered in front of their neighbours, in front of the in front of other farmers. So these things have a real sort of context in that sense. Does that get to the question, or was that? Yep. Yeah. Yep.
Yes. Thank you for this really stimulating talk. I really enjoyed it and wanted to ask you maybe to reflect a bit more on this concept of the Chinese post-war, and particularly the end date for it, which it sounds like you're sticking with 1949.
No, absolutely not. So thank you for letting me point that out. But sorry, let me finish your question.
Maybe that's enough to let you go there, because I was wondering, at first, how much it does actually differ from the Civil War. Is this just another way of thinking about the Civil War period? Do you have a different end date? But then the other part, I'm a Japan specialist, so I'm thinking kind of comparatively as you were talking. And one thing that I think comes up a lot in the Japanese case is the endless debates about when the post-war actually
Yes.
ends.
When does Sengo actually end? Do you have the answer to that? Because I don't.
Well, and I think one thing, it varies a lot by geography. Like Okinawa's post-war is very different than mainland Japan's post-war, and Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands post-war is still ongoing, Islander or whatever. But it's also, a historical question that comes up again and again and again. Is the occupation, is it the Olympics, is it the oil crisis, is it the death of the Hirohito Emperor, so on and so forth. And so I'm wondering, maybe that's too much to, I realize this talk maybe isn't trying to address all of that, but I was wondering how much you see 1949 or perhaps some other date as a moment when kind of all of this stuff gets put on hold for a while and we enter a kind of a different period of the Cultural Revolution or the Maoist period or whatever, or whether you see sort of continuities in certain areas of China or certain areas of Chinese politics. That's very open-ended, I realize, but if you could talk a bit more about that.
No, I'm very happy to do that, and it's a great question. I think one level, just as you've said, the Japanese Sengo, or indeed the European post-war, doesn't have an obvious end point, and indeed, whether the Russian assault on Ukraine is going to prove, as many people are saying, the end of a particular sort of post-war order is something we're debating, as we speak right now. I think the answer is it's certainly not, I personally don't intend it to be 1949. It's not meant to be literally just the sort of the 4 years of the after period. But I do think of it as something that obviously has the Civil War at the heart of it, because how could it not? But that stretches beyond that, at least into the mid-1950s. I think the idea of it is this, that the forces that are unleashed by the circumstances of the very long war with Japan are not worked through, certainly by 1949. I mean, in a sense, many of the things that emerge at that point, not least the split between the mainland and Taiwan, are products of the forces that are unleashed at that particular time. But one of the things that I think new work is beginning to really get to grips with is the idea that in some ways, the fact that you have these split jurisdictions and legitimacies between the mainland and Taiwan really matter in some quite important ways. I mean, I think I can say, without giving names and things, but I think there's going to be a postdoc coming to Arna's program during next year, whose doctoral thesis I examined at Cambridge University, and it's a fascinating study of, in particular, the way in which various types of sort of communist and anti-communist legitimacy are sought in the global south, or third world, you might say, by Taiwan and the PRC. I think the idea that perhaps existed even a little while ago, that once it was on the island, the Taiwan government had no time or interest in anything except trying to shore up its own position and, oppressing dissidents, both of which it did do to a very extensive extent, but also had really quite a strong idea of itself as an actor in the world, an actor that was part of an anti-communist front, an actor that was still a post-colonial actor in its own right, so hence the connections with all these slightly dodgy folk like Syngman Rhee and Bao Dai and so forth continue to be important, and also actually an alternative economic actor as well. One of the great ironies of the post-war is that land reform under Chiang Kai-shek goes really well. It's just it goes really well on Taiwan with American support once he's actually got away from the mainland, where it had been an absolute disaster on his part. And land reform of a very different sort is then offered in the mainland as a challenge to Asia, and indeed beyond Asia as well, as in Vietnam and other parts of an emergent revolutionary situation in Southeast Asia. Even for some time into the 1950s, the colonial challenge to the Republic of China as indeed to the People's Republic, is still there. Malaysia doesn't become independent until 1957. You have Vietnam Wars, first with the French and then with the Americans and then indeed with the Chinese eventually. In other words, all of the agendas that shape the global post-war, or even the global Cold War, I suppose, Arnaud, continue to be of relevance to the political projects that are underway both in the mainland of China and in Taiwan, even if they're not always of equal valency and equal significance. But they both matter at that time because they're in that world making the case and also pushing forward agendas that clearly suit them better than their opponent.
That is a fascinating discussion in itself. Yes.
Thank you so much for the insightful lecture. And I guess I suppose I have two questions. The first question regarding I think the question regarding the using of Yangtze and Lianjing. And I was wondering, I'm very much convinced of their, I guess, the self-reflection they are trying to practice in their diary. But the question is, how much we see this kind of process as they are being part of the product from the Yan years when the Yan campaign was just kind of started in the 42 to 45, and given that I think they has this part of continuity, I was wondering how much can we say as kind of independent of revolutionary renewal or identity process themselves, or whether they are kind of byproduct of the process during the Yan campaign and during the kind of the China post-war. The second question is, I guess you have been discussing the nationalist foreign top diplomats like Wang Shiji and also the communist cultures. And I wonder kind of during the post-war there's also the third path intellectuals. There are kind of debates about the future of China, whether
So Jiang Junmai and those sorts of people,
yes,
right?
The question is like how would we see this kind of intellectual debates as part of, I guess, the legacy of continuity that we have, and anything apparent in the current contemporary time. Thank you so much.
You had two great questions. Thanks. Well, let me try and briefly, sorry, I know we're getting to time as well, but I'll try and give a brief answer to each of them. I think the first, and I think you're absolutely right, I don't think with these sorts of very, very kind of strongly committed revolutionaries, it certainly doesn't begin in the post-war period. They have this very long engagement with the revolution from, their teenage years, from the 1920s and 30s onwards. And again, I didn't have, remotely enough time to talk about it, but each of the, well, in particular Zheng Zhi, but also to some extent Liu Enjin, they have long and quite complex personal lives, as with all, revolutionaries, that are linked with their revolutionary lives as well. And one of the elements, again, that I only talked about in passing, but in the study that I'm doing, I think has, in a sense, become more important for me, is the perhaps not surprising and somewhat depressing, but nonetheless, necessary discovery, in historically necessary discovery, that gender really makes a difference. The experience of young revolutionary women in the 1930s and 40s, even ones like Zheng Zhi, who run off in their teenage years and are taking part in some pretty violent activities, are still given a much harder time by party leaders than young men in that particular position, and that becomes visible over and over again. So I think in terms of that construction, I'd say it's certainly a very long-term thing, but actually, gender is yet another one of the frameworks that I think shapes that experience, and that's why I thought it was very important to make sure that, at least a significant amount of the revolutionary experience that one considers during this period is from women as well as from men. In terms of that third force of intellectuals, I've been doing some reading on some of the people. One of the people who, again, is very well known, but sometimes some of his specifics are not always as studied as they might be, partly because he wrote so much, is Liang Shuming. And Liang Shuming, because, in a sense, for English-speaking scholarly readers, he's been characterized as the last Confucian, Dai Lito's famous book. But in a sense, he is that, but he's much more as well in various ways. And one of the interesting things, and again, Arnaud, because you know everything on Mao and his various things, but when Liang Shuming kind of takes this sort of flight to meet Mao and these other guys, where they're still in Yan'an about 1946, and sort of has a long chat with them. And there's this wonderful scene in which Liang Shuming explains in great detail this very, very complex political system that he thinks is going to sort of navigate between a Western-style government, which he doesn't think is going to work in China, and a Bolshevik-style government, which he doesn't think is going to work in China, and the Kuomintang, which he hates as well and thinks that's not going to work. And it involves lots. He makes comparisons with what's happening in the United Nations, which are just being set up at that time, and what you can take from various traditional Chinese things. Anyway, it takes a long time. He's talking to Mao Zedong, he's talking to Zhu De, he's talking to lots of really top people, and then At the end, he stops. This is his own, recollection of it, so he's sort of telling it against himself. And there's just silence, and all these top communist leaders are like staring at him. And then finally, I think it's actually Jules says, so it took you 30 years to work that out, did it? And they turn on to other subjects quite quickly. So there's definitely a willingness to hear, but whether or not people actually react to some of these people, I think, unfortunately, is not as obvious in that case. But it's interesting to see that the efforts that they made, and I think that they're by no means as needful of being dismissed as they sometimes are. They were an important part of a much richer debate than sometimes realised.
I think we have time for one more question, if there's one. But let us go with two. Ginny first, then Denise.
Hi. I'm just going to come forward a little bit so I can
just
try
really
to
louder. So I think it's fascinating that you're able to work with a lot of personal writings and diaries. And my question is, because I know diary writing for that time period is not just like a personal habit, but also required by a lot of institutions like military and schools. So I'm just wondering, when we work with this kind of sources as historians, how do we acknowledge the background and some potential bias that the writers might have, and how do we deal with that in your research? Thank you so much.
Could we do these two together?
Yeah,
Is that okay for you?
absolutely. Let's get them together.
Professor Lowe.
Yep, absolutely.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Actually, my question is similar to Judy's. I was thinking about the use, both the use of diaries in this talk and also the juxtaposition of diaries. In some ways, all of them are about calling into being a new kind of world, whether it's a new kind of global order or a new kind of self-identification. So I'd also like to ask you to speak more about the choice of the diaries, the use of the diaries, and then what is the audience for the diaries, and then I guess the larger question is how, how is the act of writing different from the act of speaking? And how is writing and being this vision of the world different from speaking it and being?
Great. No, thanks. Two wonderful questions to finish off with in related areas. I mean, no diaries or no personal accounts of any sort are, in any sense, pure or unmediated or authentic. Everything is constructed in some particular idea. And one of the reasons I gave a quick sort of drive-by shooting to the idea of the liberal subject, and hey, I'm a liberal subject, I love the liberal subject, is that we, university-educated, Ivy League type people living in the Western world speaking English, tend to assume it's normative and that other things are deviations or anomalies from them, e.g. the construction of the mind of a young communist cadre in the 1940s. So part of what I was trying to do is point out that not that there's any sense in which these things are not constructed. I mean, part of the answer to your question is that at that time, one of the ways in which you're expected to self-discipline is to write personal accounts, and particularly in the case of mid-level cadres and others, they would quite often be read and inspected and discussed by senior officers elsewhere as well. So the idea that these were purely private documents wouldn't necessarily be the case. I would recommend, by the way, the fantastic book Writing War by Aaron William Moore, which is about different types of Chinese, Japanese, and indeed American service people's diaries, servicemen's diaries mostly, and how they are used to try and sort of both mediate through a professional obligation and a sense of creation of the self. But I think one of the things, I think the other answer to the question is how can we kind of use them productively? I think it's true as of all these sorts of sources that you have to read against the grain. I mean, it's the phrase that has become the stock one, but it's useful in this sense. And in particular case, the things that I think they are useful for are things like understanding where the flaws and difficulties in the revolution come about that are later smoothed out by the idea that actually everything that the party does, goes well and that everyone follows the revolutionary path. And one of the things that is clearest across these very different diaries from different people in different parts of China at various times is that the revolution, surprise, surprise, was not a smooth and easy process and had a lot of complexities within it during that time. But the one thing I think we probably can't do and we can, I think, take pride in having to work around this, is that, unlike Leopold von Ranke, the idea of wir es eigentlich gewesen, how it really was, that isn't really what people's construction of themselves does, because everything is going to be mediated through a set of positions, whether it's gender or class or geography or emotion, which I think is one of the really important ones. It is really different reading diary entrances from Chen Boulay, who's a senior man who is suffering a mental health issue that eventually will help him, force him to take his own life, and the work of the writings of a 22-year-old woman who is having a, very, very bad personal life experience at that time in terms of her relationship, but on the other hand is part of what she perceives and repeatedly defines herself as being part of an ongoing transformative project of which she is very enthusiastic to be a part. And all these things are visible in terms of the way in which they present themselves, but they're not simply capable, I think, of being separated out as being either sort of positive or negative or supportive or unsupportive of a particular political project, that they're more complex than that.
Thank you very much, Rana. I was also thinking about the gender dimension, so I actually discussed it in my research seminar a couple of weeks ago, and the significance for trying to understand periods of tremendous change, like the one that you are dealing with, through being able to listen to women's voices in different positions and different situations. And how often, even today, that is not done. I mean, it was one of the things that struck me when I worked on the Civil War era in China, what a period of breakthroughs for women that was. I mean, in organizational terms, but also in much broader terms, in intellectual life, in terms of what went on in the countryside. So maybe we could have you back when this project is nearing completion.
Delighted.
About that dimension and other dimensions rather. But first and foremost, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture today. We really